Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is blacks and the Declaration of Independence. And we're fortunate to have with us this morning a specialist in the black experience in America, Dr. RMitchell1, the assistant to the president at Fisk University, as well as the chairperson of the Department of History at Fisk. And Dr. Mitchell, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
It is a pleasure to be here to celebrate Independence Day.
Dr. Mitchell, you know, I think that we've talked about the black experience in America, and we've talked about the Declaration of Independence. What we'd like to do this morning is to give our viewers an opportunity to sort of evaluate the reason that black people ought to become involved in the celebration of the Declaration of Independence this morning. Let's talk about the introduction of black people into the Americas.
Dr. Hayne, you know, that is a most interesting topic and a most misunderstood topic, because those of African descent in America have been here since Columbus, and some say even before. Certainly with Columbus, there was an African. When you look at the Americas, first the Spanish settled the Caribbean. And the Spanish settled the Caribbean by setting up sugar plantations. In Latin America and in Brazil, when the Spanish and Portuguese in Brazil settled, they became involved in mining. And many African slaves were brought in. With interest, it was the Spanish missionary, Bartholomew de las Casas, who requested that the Amerindians, the Indian population in Brazil, not be forced into the mining. And Bartholomew de las Casas requested of the Pope that the African be allowed. The Africans were brought and were involved in mining because many of the Africans who were slaves had worked in mining in Africa. I think it's important to realize that those of us with African ancestry who brought to America, we brought many skills with us. And those skills were the economic backbone and the use of slavery. Certainly those agriculturalists who will later settle on the mainland, beginning in 1619 in Virginia, they had been agriculturalists in Africa. So the rotation of crops and the working in the fields was nothing new but a skill they brought with them.
Well, let's look at those who came in 1619. I think oftentimes we hear that the first group of black people came to North America in 1619, as you've indicated. Yes. And there's a whole question in terms of their status. Were they actually free, or were they indentured servants, or were they slaves, and et cetera? Right. Let's clear that up before we talk about the Declaration.
Certainly prior to 1619, there was no slavery in America. With the 1619 group, there was no identity between black skin and slavery. Those 21 or so who were brought by the Dutch accidentally ended up in Virginia. The Dutch were headed to their colony in New York. And those 21 or so Africans were part of a group of commodities that were to be exchanged in New York. Getting off course, the Dutch man of war ended in Virginia, and they needed to trade some of their commodities, other commodities, especially food and water. So the 21 or so Africans were traded off. They actually became indentured servants. And as many Americans are aware, because many Anglo-Saxons who would later come to America would come as indentured servants, those 21 or so indentured themselves. That meant for several or more years they would use their labor to pay off whatever the value was that was put on them. And actually it was a form of contract labor. I amuse with my students about this, where the term indentured comes from, because you know, lawyers, on one end of the paper, I'd agree to be your slave for 7 years. I'd agree on the other end. We tear. You'd be given part of the contract, I'd be given part. At the end of 7 years, if the indents fit together, I'd be given my freedom. Those 21 Africans became free. They settled in Virginia, and by 1625, they themselves were part of the community. This can be backed up by church records. Many of those 25 were buried in cemeteries, so there was no slavery based on color. Now, after 1625 or so, with the success of tobacco, the Virginians needed a source of labor to carry out the work in the fields.
Now, this is almost 100 years before the time of the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly.
And so essentially what you're saying is that there will be almost 100 years in which black people are held in servitude.
That's right.
One way or the other.
That's right.
In the various colonies. Let's talk about that servitude.
All right. Certainly everyone is familiar with the South and plantation slavery. and blacks were brought in and used in a number of ways. Plantation slavery becomes the economic backbone of the South and the North, because many New Englanders will make their money by trading, taking ships to Africa and trading for slaves. And the carrying trade or shipping trade was the backbone of New England to provide plantation labor. Now, in the Northeast and in colonial New England, you also find servitude or slavery, but you didn't have plantations there. And in a very excellent book entitled Black Yankees by my colleague at Fisk University, Dr. William Pearson, he discusses slavery in New England. If you were a shoemaker, you would take a slave and train him to be an apprentice, a shoemaker. If you were a candle maker, if you were a printer. So actually you have servitude appearing to be as slavery. I think that the missing ingredient in that 100 years is that many of those servants in New England would become, in fact, free. So you had another population that's often forgotten. At the time of the American Revolution, you had more than 1 million free blacks.
Let's talk about that free black population, Dr. Mitchell, because I think that so many people become involved with this whole question of slavery.
That's right.
That they often overlook this element, and I understand it's a very, very important element.
And I know in your classroom teaching, just as in my classroom teaching, I point out that the slave experience is not the total African-American experience. Not every African-American prior to 1865 was a slave. You know, I tell you today, not every black man plays basketball or dances. People have ethnic and cultural differences. Many African-Americans were, in fact, free people of color. You might gain your freedom, one, by buying it. You might be given your freedom. Many a times, if you are held and you wish, and if you're free and you wish to marry a woman who's held, you buy her from a master. So any number of ways that you might become free, especially in an area like New England where it's not dependent upon slave labor. I think what people sometimes fail to realize is also it's expensive to keep slaves. If I enslave you, I must pay for your medical costs, I must feed you, I must take care of you. If you are my worker, I pay you when you come to work. If you get sick, you have to figure out how to take care of it. If you're hungry and you aren't working, that's not my responsibility. So as New England does not develop a plantation system, you don't see slavery. Even in the South, slavery was economically dying out. And then in the late 1790s, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin and makes cotton a staple crop. It's ironic because during the period prior to the American Revolution and just before, slavery was dying out. Now, many a black man also became free by his participation in the Revolutionary Army. There was a feeling that you can't have a slave fighting for a free man's freedom. So many times when African Americans would join the Army, they would be given their freedom or granted their freedom. Also, in the period of time between the American Revolution, which ended in 1775-76, the Declaration of Independence during that period of time, and the development of the United States in 1789, there's a great emotional feeling in the country of freedom, of manhood rights. And many persons freed their slaves. Only in the South, because of the economic dependence. And I think